A boy is being shaved bald in a foreign bathhouse. Nobody asked him first. His hands are shaking, though the water is warm. Somewhere inside him, a decision is already forming, one no empire has trained him to make. Outside the window, the ziggurats of Babylon catch the last light of a day that ended everything he used to be called. He does not know it yet, but this room, tiled, perfumed, humming with the quiet efficiency of a machine built to erase 400 boys a year, is where his story actually begins. Not in a lion's den, not in front of a king reading handwriting on a wall. Here, in the steam, in the sound of a razor against a skull that 3 weeks ago still smelled like his mother's bread. His name was Daniel. God is my judge. By tonight, a scribe will write a different name into a ledger, and no one in this city will ever call him Daniel again, except in the end, himself. To understand what is being taken from him, you have to understand what the world looked like 3 weeks before this bath. In 605 BC, the armies of Nebuchadnezzar II stood outside the walls of Jerusalem for the first time. Not the final, devastating siege of 586 that would level the temple, but an earlier one, quieter, almost administrative in its cruelty. King Jehoiakim surrendered the city rather than watch it burn, and as part of the terms, the Babylonians did what conquering empires of the period routinely did. They took hostages, not soldiers, not the poor. They took the sons of the nobility, the sharpest, healthiest, most promising boys in the kingdom, and marched them east across nearly 900 miles of desert toward a city so large it seemed to some of them like a fever dream. Walls wide enough for chariots to turn on top of them, hanging gardens climbing toward a sky that smelled of cedar smoke and river mud. Daniel was one of those boys. Historians estimate his age at the time of deportation between 14 and 16, a detail that rarely survives in the paintings, which prefer to imagine him as a grown sage with a long beard staring calmly into a lion's mouth. But the text itself, read carefully, tells a different story. He was a teenager, displaced, frightened, walking into the most powerful empire on earth with nothing but his name and whatever his mother had managed to whisper to him the night before the soldiers came. 2 other names walk beside him in the record, though the book will only linger on 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Friends since before any of them can remember, boys who learned the Shema together in the same small courtyard, who now share the same terror in the same foreign wagon. The world he is leaving behind is small and specific. A house near the upper city, close enough to the temple that the smoke of the evening sacrifice sometimes drifted over the courtyard wall. A father whose face is described nowhere in Scripture and who therefore exists in this story only as an absence. A man who is never mentioned again, which is its own kind of information. A mother's hands. A language he will spend the next 70 years half forgetting and refusing all at once to fully let go of. The first sign comes quietly. An official at the edge of the deportation column walks slower than the rest, studying the boys' faces the way a buyer studies livestock, checking teeth, checking posture, making marks on a wax tablet. This is Ashpenaz, chief of the eunuchs, master of the king's court. None of the boys know his name yet, or what his interest in them means. The second sign is the food. 3 days into the march east, the boys are given rations different from the soldiers guarding them. Richer, better, meat that has clearly come from a temple offering rather than a field kitchen. Nobody explains why. Daniel notices it before he understands it. The third sign is the silence. In the wagon behind them were the older captives, priests, officials, men who remember the temple in its full glory, have stopped speaking almost entirely. Grief in this culture, in this moment, does not scream. It goes quiet. The boys watch that silence settle over the adults like dust, and something in each of them decides, without words, that they will not let it settle over themselves the same way. The historical layer matters here because the modern viewer assumes captivity meant chains and starvation. For these boys, it meant something more disorienting. Comfort weaponized, good food, warm beds, access to the finest education in the ancient Near East. The empire was not trying to break their bodies. It was trying to replace their minds, gently, generously, one privilege at a time. Before any of this, there was a rooftop in Jerusalem and a boy lying on his back counting stars his grandfather had named for him one by one. Kessel, the fool, the constellation the old man swore was Orion bound in chains, a joke about arrogance that made no sense to a child, but that Daniel repeated anyway, just to hear his grandfather laugh. That memory matters, because everything the Babylonian program is about to build in Daniel, the language, the literature, the court manners, the astrology, will be laid over a foundation that was already there. He was not an empty vessel arriving in Babylon. He was a boy raised inside the Shema, inside the story of a God who freed slaves and split seas and kept impossible promises across 400 years of silence. That story was not decoration, it was structure, and structure, unlike decoration, does not come off easily. There is another memory, smaller, almost embarrassing in its ordinariness. Daniel, maybe 11, refusing to eat a neighbor's offering of meat at a festival because his mother had quietly shaken her head. Not a lecture, not a scene, just a small motion of her chin toward the door. He didn't understand the dietary law fully. He understood his mother's face. That is how conviction usually arrives in a child, long before it arrives as theology, as a face you trust, making a small motion you learn to read. This is the part the modern viewer needs woven in early because it will explain everything that happens in the palace later. Daniel's refusal of the king's food is not going to be a dramatic act of theological courage performed for an audience. It is going to be the same small, quiet motion his mother made at a festival table years earlier, repeated now alone in a much larger and much more dangerous room. The Babylonian training program these boys are entering, what Assyriologists sometimes call the Mar'u Umani, the sons of the master, an elite curriculum for foreign hostages being groomed for administrative service, ran roughly 3 years. They studied cuneiform, Akkadian literature, astrology, and omen interpretation, which functioned in Babylon the way economic forecasting functions today, as the tool by which the powerful tried to predict and control an uncertain future. The boys who succeeded in this program did not return home. They became the empire's most useful instrument, men who looked like conquered peoples, but thought like Babylonians, deployed back into the very populations they had been taken from, or kept at court as living proof of imperial reach. Then came something even more personal. Ashpenaz changed their names. Daniel, El is my judge, became Belteshazzar, a name built from Bel, one of Marduk's titles, the chief god of Babylon. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious, became Shadrach. Mishael, who is what God is, became Meshach. Azariah, Yahweh has helped, became Abednego, servant of Nebo, another Babylonian deity. This was not bureaucratic tidiness. In the ancient world, a new name was a theological claim. Every time a court official addressed these boys by their new names, he was, whether he realized it or not, declaring which God had won. It is one of the most quietly violent things an empire can do to a captive, not burn his home, but rename his God out of his own mouth every single day for the rest of his life. If a story like this, real history hiding inside a familiar Bible passage, is the kind of thing you want more of, this is exactly what Sacred Chronicles does every week. Consider joining the channel now so you don't miss what these four boys do next. The bathhouse scene from the opening now plays out in full. Daniel is shaved, a Babylonian custom, unfamiliar and slightly humiliating to a Judean raised to associate long hair and beard with adult male dignity. He is dressed in the fine linen of the royal court, a fabric his family back in Jerusalem could never have afforded, even for a wedding. He is given a room in the palace complex with better light and better air than anything he has ever slept in. None of it is cruelty. On its surface, that is precisely the point. You will eat what the king eats, Ashpenaz tells the four boys on their first night, not unkindly. Wine from the royal table, meat prepared by the palace kitchens. In 3 years, if you are found worthy, you will stand before Nebuchadnezzar himself. It should be the best offer any of them has ever received. It is also, quietly, a trap that none of the other captive boys in the program seem to notice, or perhaps notice, and simply decide not to fight. The king's food and wine in the religious economy of Babylon was not neutral. A portion of it had almost certainly been offered first to Marduk, Bel, or Nebo before ever reaching the royal table. To eat it was not merely a dietary choice, it was participation in the worship system of a foreign god. And beneath that theological layer sat a simpler, more human one. Eating at the king's table meant depending on the king's table, being formed, quite literally, by what the empire chose to feed you. Daniel does the math quickly, in a room lit by a single oil lamp, his 3 friends watching him. I am not going to defile myself with this, he says. Not to a crowd, not as a sermon, quietly, to Ashpenaz, alone, the way you say something you have already decided and are only now informing another person. Here is where the story truly turns. It is not, contrary to how it is usually taught to children, a simple moment of a brave boy standing up to an evil king. Ashpenaz is not a villain. He is a career official whose own life is now on the line because of a teenager's conscience. I am afraid of my lord the king, Ashpenaz says. The fear is not performative. Nebuchadnezzar is not a ruler who tolerates failed experiments quietly. He has appointed your food and drink. If he sees your faces thinner than the other young men your age, my head answers for it, not yours. This is the detail almost never taught alongside this story, and it is the one that transforms it from a simple moral lesson into something genuinely difficult. Daniel's convictions are not free. If he is wrong, if the plan he is about to propose fails, if he and his friends actually do grow gaunt and weak on a diet of vegetables and water, an innocent bureaucrat, a man simply doing his job inside a brutal system, could lose his life. Faith under pressure is never faith in a vacuum. It is faith that costs someone else too. That evening, the first royal meal is placed before the 4 boys. Rich meat, fine wine, food fit for a king. They do not touch it. The dishes slowly cool while the other captive boys eat without hesitation. Some glance toward the 4 of them. Some look confused. Others look suspicious. Daniel finally steps forward with a proposal, not an act of open rebellion, not an impossible demand, just a test. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with the young men who eat the king's food. After that, deal with your servants according to what you see. It is a compromise, a reasonable request. Yet even as he speaks, Daniel has no certainty that it will succeed. That night, alone in his room, he wonders whether he has just asked another man to risk his life for nothing. Hananiah quietly breaks the silence. What happens if it doesn't work? Daniel doesn't answer, not because he has confidence, but because he doesn't. The truth is simple. He does not know, and saying those words aloud somehow makes the risk feel even more real. The steward assigned to watch over them, a lower official carrying none of Ashpenaz's political authority but all of his practical anxiety, reluctantly agrees. 10 days, vegetables, water, no wine, no meat, no royal delicacies. If the experiment fails, the boys will quietly return to the king's table. No accusations, no scandal, no reports. Only 4 teenagers and 1 nervous steward will ever know the experiment happened. Night 3 arrives. Daniel cannot sleep. His stomach folds in on itself. His hands feel thinner than they did a week ago. Or perhaps that is only fear pretending to be hunger. He does not pray out loud. There is nothing left to say that has not already been said. Instead, he watches the flame of a small oil lamp bend in the draught, coming through the window. He remains perfectly still, as though staying still might keep something else from bending too. What if I was wrong? What if conviction was only pride wearing a religious coat? His mouth is dry. His ribs ache beneath the fine linen of the Babylonian court. For the first time in his life, faith is no longer something he simply inherited. It becomes something he must choose. No speeches, no miracles, only silence, only breathing, only the crushing weight of a decision that has not yet been proven right, resting on the chest of a 14-year-old boy in the dark. Day 6 of the trial is the hardest. Daniel can barely finish the small portion of vegetables placed before him. Not because of principle anymore, because his stomach has shrunk. Even this modest meal feels strangely overwhelming, and yet nowhere near enough. He sits with the bowl in front of him for most of the meal, unable to eat, unable to explain to Mishael, sitting across from him, why the very food that is supposed to prove him right suddenly makes him feel weak. By now, word has spread through the training compound the way it always does among teenage boys living in close quarters. The other captives have noticed. Boys from Egypt, from Elam, from Media. all eating freely from the king's table. One of them, older than Daniel, and already comfortable with his Babylonian name and Babylonian customs, finally asks the question everyone has been thinking. Do you think you're better than the rest of us? Daniel has no easy answer. He is not trying to be better. He is only trying to remain who he was, but he knows that saying so will sound exactly like the accusation. That night, alone once again, another question finds him. Has he misunderstood everything? The God who allowed Jerusalem to fall, the God who allowed the temple to be plundered, the God who allowed his family to disappear behind the walls of a conquered city. Does he really care whether 4 teenage hostages eat vegetables or meat in a palace nearly 900 miles away? It would be so much easier to believe he doesn't. It would be easier, period. By the 8th night, even those closest to him begin to struggle. Hananiah watches Daniel grow thinner. He sees the exhaustion in his face, the uncertainty in his eyes. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he speaks softly. We could eat just one meal, just one. No one would ever know. Tomorrow we can continue the trial, as if nothing happened. It is not temptation disguised as rebellion. It is temptation disguised as compassion. A friend who loves him simply cannot watch him suffer any longer. Daniel looks at the bowl. The smell of roasted meat drifts through the corridor outside, warm, rich, comforting. For a long moment, he hesitates. The easiest relief imaginable sits only a few steps away. No one would know, no speeches, no consequences, no public failure, only one meal. Then everything could continue as before, slowly, almost painfully. Daniel shakes his head. He says nothing. He simply stands, returns to his room, and closes the door behind him. The decision is not triumphant. It is exhausting. It costs him another night of hunger, another night of uncertainty, another night of being the strange one among boys his own age inside a system designed to make strangeness expensive. Each morning, the steward continues to inspect the 4 boys. He offers no encouragement, no words of faith, only anxious eyes measuring their faces, calculating the risk to his own future. His concern is practical, not spiritual. Yet even that quiet, imperfect presence becomes part of the burden they carry together. Then the 10th morning arrives. Nothing dramatic happens. No thunder, no music, no spectacle. Daniel simply gets up, as he has every morning before. He walks to the place where the steward is waiting. He says nothing. He simply allows himself to be examined. The steward studies the faces of the 4 young men longer than usual. Relief slowly replaces tension. They appear healthier, he finally says, almost to himself. Better nourished than all the young men who have been eating the king's food. There is no celebration, no applause, only the quiet realization that the experiment has succeeded. The vegetables and water are no longer a temporary trial. They simply become the way the 4 friends will continue to live. And life inside Babylon quietly moves on. Weeks pass. The diet of vegetables and water is no longer an experiment. It simply becomes part of daily life. No one talks about it anymore. The training continues. Daniel throws himself into the work before him. He learns Akkadian script. He studies the literature of Babylon. He reads the omen texts the empire's scholars have trusted for generations. He learns everything Babylon is willing to teach him. He never confuses knowledge with worship. That distinction quietly shapes the rest of his life. He will master Babylonian wisdom without surrendering to Babylonian gods. One morning, almost without realizing it, Daniel catches his reflection in the polished surface of a palace window. The fine linen of the royal court rests naturally on his shoulders now. His head is cleanly kept according to Babylonian custom. When officials address him, they call him Belteshazzar. He answers, not because he has forgotten who he is, because he understands that the name others use cannot decide the man he has become. Every evening, when the duties of the court are finished, his prayers still travel west, toward Jerusalem, toward a city lying under the shadow of defeat, toward a temple that no longer stands as it once did. The empire has changed his language. It has changed his education. It has changed his clothing. It has even changed the name written beside his own in the royal records. But none of those things have reached the place where his faith still lives. 3 years pass. The day of examination finally arrives. Ashpenaz gathers the young men who have completed the royal training. One by one, they are presented before Nebuchadnezzar himself. The king speaks with them, questions them, measures their understanding, tests their judgment. When Daniel and his 3 friends stand before the throne, they are no longer frightened boys from Jerusalem. They have become educated men inside the greatest empire on earth. Yet, something remains unmistakably different about them. The record says that in every matter of wisdom and understanding, the king questioned them about. He found Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his kingdom. Their faithfulness had never prevented them from learning. It had only prevented them from surrendering. That quiet decision, made years earlier over a simple meal, had shaped everything that followed. Not the vegetables themselves, not the water, but the willingness to remain faithful when no one was watching. That was the foundation upon which the rest of Daniel's life would be built. The dreams, the lion's den, the kingdoms that would rise and fall before his eyes. None of those stories truly began in a palace audience chamber. They began with a frightened teenager who quietly decided that an empire could educate him, but it would never own him. He is standing before the throne now, 17 or 18 years old, clothed in the finest robes of the Babylonian court. Everyone in the room calls him Belteshazzar. He does not correct them. That is worth pausing over for a moment. It is not weakness. Daniel understood something many modern readers often miss. The name Babylon gave him was never the real battle. The food was. The worship was. His loyalty was. His name, his position, his education, even his fluency in the language and literature of the empire that conquered him. None of those things were the line he chose to draw. He allowed Babylon to call him whatever it wished. He simply refused to let Babylon decide what he believed. That distinction between accommodation and surrender is the true inheritance of this story, far more valuable than any dramatic scene involving a den of lions. The famine that would later devastate Jerusalem never reached Daniel the way it reached those who remained behind. In the years ahead, he would serve under 4 different kings. He would interpret dreams no one else could understand. He would survive political purges and deadly conspiracies that destroyed men far more powerful than a former hostage should ever have outlived. But none of that is where his greatness began. It began here, inside a training compound, at 14 or 15 years old, with a simple bowl of vegetables, a decision he was fully prepared to discover had been the wrong one. The cost was real: 10 days of hunger, 10 days of uncertainty, a frightened friend whose compassion almost persuaded him to give up, a steward whose career unknowingly rested on the outcome of a teenager's conviction, and a foreign name he would answer to for the rest of his life, a name that was never truly his. Daniel counted that cost before he ever asked for the 10-day trial. When the days were over, when the steward found the 4 boys healthier than the others, when the door to a lifetime inside the greatest court on earth opened before him, he walked through it. Still the same boy who had once lain on a rooftop in Jerusalem while his grandfather pointed out the stars. Still praying toward a city that had lost almost everything. Still carrying, beneath the linen robes and beneath the Babylonian name, an identity no empire had been able to erase. Years later, he would stand once again beside another window, looking west, toward Jerusalem, toward the place where the temple had once stood. He would understand then what had been true from the very beginning. Babylon was never the end of his story. It was the place where his faith stopped being inherited and became his own. If this story moved something in you, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you'd like to continue exploring the real history behind the Bible with us, subscribe to Sacred Chronicles so you don't miss the next story.